Well, welcome. Okay. Let's start it. Welcome. Sorry, I meant to get back to our introduction to the Bible before now. I lost my notes that I was going to use for the last session, but I found them again, and so we're going to continue our discussion of the Pentateuch. Now, our topic for this evening is the literary flow of the Pentateuch and what we can learn about the Pentateuch's interests and agendas, what it's trying to do by what it centralizes and what it concentrates on. And then we'll talk about Rabbinic Judaism, and prior to that, ancient Israel, who produced the text, and what they're trying to achieve. And then we'll talk about what Christian readers, especially through what the Apostle Paul does with the Pentateuch, we'll talk a little bit about that interest. We touched on this a little bit in some previous videos, but and we'll dive back into that again before we're done this evening. And so let's begin. Okay, let's just look at how the Pentateuch breaks down. Yeah, we have the first 50 chapters, of course, is Genesis. So we have Genesis 1 through 11, often called the primeval history, having to do, of course, with the creation of the world, the Hebrew Bible's flood story, scattering of the nations upon the earth after the flood, Tower of Babel, and things like that. Then we have 12 to 50. Genesis 12 to 50 was the patriarchal history, which is basically broken into three basic narratives with some connective materials between them. So we have 12 to 22, which is the main heart of the Abraham narrative, in which he goes to Egypt and returns with great wealth. Okay. We have some intervening materials, and then we have the Joseph narrative from about 26. Not Joseph, I'm getting ahead of myself. We have the Jacob narrative, which is from 25, 26, all the way through like 36, just on the cusp of the Joseph story, where we see Joseph going to his relatives in Aram to get a wife, and he comes back wealthy, back to comes back to the land of Canaan wealthy. And then from 38 down to the end of the book of Genesis, we have Jacob going. We have Joseph, of course, going to Egypt and becoming, for all intents and purposes, ruler of Egypt. Only the Pharaoh above him, where he saves the world from famine. So those are the three main stories that make up the book of Genesis. This leaving and coming back with wealth and power is a main story there. That leaving and returning, a major theme in Genesis. We'll talk more about that when we get into Genesis proper. So that's Genesis. Of course, at the end of Genesis, the Israelites are in Egypt, where they grow and outnumber the Egyptians. They become very powerful, and on their way out of Egypt, they get great wealth. So we have Exodus 1 to 18, Israel in Egypt and the Exodus. What's very important here, but we want to touch base a little bit, are a couple of the stories that are right before the Sinai, the very extensive Sinai material, where we have manna from heaven and water from the rock. Now that's very important. So put kind of like a little pin in that as they come up to Sinai. That Sinai, they have 19, kind of like the agreement to the covenant. We have 20 to 24 of Exodus, which is the covenant book, and then there at 24 we have the ratification of the covenant. (25) to Exodus 40, we have at Sinai, where we have the instructions to Moses for the tabernacle and the priestly vestments, things like that, tabernacle furnishings. We have the golden calf event. Then we have the building of the tabernacle, which goes in Leviticus. We'll really delve into the structure of Leviticus later. It's basically, it's a bit more complicated than that, and about divided into two pieces. We have Leviticus 1 to 16, which is kind of a book for priests, kind of an instruction manual for sacrifices and stuff like that. A little bit more detailed than that, but that's the basics for 1 to 16 Leviticus. And then from 17 on to basically the end of Leviticus to 26, we have the covenant law code. We have the, not covenant law, have what's called the holiness code, which is, and then at 27 we have miscellaneous laws at the end of the holiness code. So that's this second bit of legal material that's in the Pentateuch, at the end of Leviticus. Now we have Numbers 1 to 10, where we have sort of a census. But prior to that, we have more. We have the crossing of the Red Sea. We have the census. We have a bunch of more laws. And then at Numbers 10, they are ready to go. They're ready to leave the promised land. I mean, to enter the promised land. That's Numbers 11 to Numbers 13, going to the promised land. But what we have to remember about 11 to 13, and this is important, is we have some material there that's quite similar to what we read at before, back in like Exodus 16 and 17, where we again in Numbers we have leaving Sinai. After Sinai, again we have God providing manna. Then in Numbers 20, we have God providing water. Very similar to what we see, though not identical, what we see in Exodus right before Israelites arrive on Sinai. Now, what makes a difference this time with the giving of the manna and the quail this time, and then the water from the rock is it's mixed with judgment, because there's some rebelliousness on the part of the people, on the part of Moses, connected with those stories this time. And then what we see here after Numbers, we get Numbers as well. We have the allotment of the land toward the end of Numbers, and we have the preparing to enter the promised land. So a big chunk of Numbers about getting ready to go into the promised land. Wilderness, first because of disobedience, we have wilderness wanderings, and then we have the dividing up the land and things like that. We have some different stories in Numbers 21 to 36. A lot of them dealing with Balaam the prophet and his shenanigans trying to get Israel in trouble. Yeah. They end up the book of Numbers. And then we have Deuteronomy, which is after the wilderness wanderings, and that generation dies off for the most part, except for the young at the except for the young at the time they started wandering the wilderness for that about 40 years. In Deuteronomy, Moses kind of like it's a restatement of the law and a re-ratification for the covenant for those survivors of the wilderness wanderings and the generation that was born in the wilderness. You know, right outside the promised land. And so what we see here, we see a couple things that are important. And we're just going to look at how the material is. First of all, we'll look at how much space is given to the giving of the law of the promised land, giving of the law around about 60 chapters. And the promised land, divvying that up, about 50 chapters. So, giving the law, Israel living in the promised land are the two big themes out of material. And then what we see, based on how the Pentateuch is organized, that Sinai, the covenant made with Israel, dominates the center. And what makes it seem even more central is the fact that before and after the Sinai material dealing with the tabernacle and the tabernacle, priests and sacrificial system, and two of the law codes are put in central, and both preceding and after we have stories that are very central, dealing with the provision of manna, dealing with punishing rebellion, and the like. And so what we get from this is that what the Pentateuch is trying to do, trying to lift up as central, is the formation of the Israelite community around the covenant and Torah. We have that's the concern of Genesis through Numbers, and that's the concern again after the wilderness wanderings for Deuteronomy. So that is the concern of how the Pentateuch structured, of course, for Israel provides an impetus for that. Probably, even though it's based on earlier material, the Pentateuch probably reached kind of like this nascent canonical form. We'll talk more about this next time we meet, the nascent canonical form in the 8th century BC, about the time when trying to reorganize Israelite society after the destruction of the northern kingdom, and Hezekiah's reforms centering on Torah and worshiping in the temple, pushing this to the center of Israelite society in ways that it probably had never been before. There's so much evidence that prior to this 8th century, and then of course the 8th century BC, and then especially 7th century BC with the Josianic reform, that look at King David, for example. There's not much indication that King David knew much about Torah. Probably some. He had some body of priestly instruction from like a pre-Torah. But it's in this 8th century, I think, when they're struggling with organizing Israelite society after the calamity of the Assyrians, where the nascent canonical Torah, canonical Pentateuch, begins to take shape. Now, on a word for Christian interpretation, because Christian interests are different, what establishes community for the Christian community is the death and resurrection of Jesus, baptism, and things like that. And so what's central if we look at the Apostle Paul, then what's essential to the Apostle Paul, which I'm taking as an exemplar of early Christian Pentateuchal interpretation, what is central for Paul is the book of Genesis. That sin entered the world through one man, Adam, that we get in Romans 5. Salvation by faith before the works of the law were introduced, because Paul interprets Genesis. Paul was pronounced righteous because of his faith. Paul was righteous because of his faith before the before